Hello, good morning. Nice to be here again, and nice to see some of you. We're here for another chapter of Slaves for the Isabella. I knew you would think I didn't know what I was doing. I really ought to by now, because I've been reading these online for months. Well, I did have a break in the middle. I did, as some of you will know, I did the first 4 books in lockdown. So I did The Leopard in the Golden Cage, which is Romans, Saving the Unicorn's Horn, which is Vikings, the Tudor one, which is the Falconer's Quarry, and The Demon in the Embers, which is The Great Fire of London. I did those between March and June, and then I had a break, and now we're back to do this one. And yeah, I ought to know what I'm doing by now, really. I do, really. It's just Friday. My writing's not going quite so well this morning. I'm writing a new book, and I'm really, really near to the end now. I've got about, let's have a look. I'm on chapter 38, and I think it's going to be 42 chapters, so I'm really close to the end. But some days it works, and some days it doesn't. And today is one of the days where it's not quite working. The last couple of paragraphs I've written, I'm fairly sure I'm just going to have to go back in after I've done this and click the delete key. Right, so chapter 6, Jo discovered from Dad what the connection to the slave trade is for Bristol, what the connection is for Lucy's family, because they're completely involved in it, and he can see that. And Lucy seems oblivious as far as he can tell, because it hasn't come up yet while he's been in her world. He's still back in our time. Did I say it hasn't come up while he's been in our world? I meant it didn't come up while he was in her world. So he's still back in our time with Dad in Bristol. So we'll pick up there, chapter 7. Jo and Dad spent Saturday afternoon at Bristol, so it wasn't until the next morning that they set out to see more of the city. It was clear and bright, and not as early as the previous day, because Dad had insisted on cooking a huge breakfast for them at the apartment. "We can't have you flaking out again," he said. Jo smiled faintly. Bacon wasn't going to save him, and anyway, he wasn't sure this morning he wanted to be saved. He still felt very nervous about the prospect of confronting Lucy about her family's involvement in slavery. But that wasn't going to go away. It would be better, really, to just get on with it. They walked down King Street, past some almshouses, the Theatre Royal, and several Tudor buildings, all of which must have existed in Lucy's time, Jo guessed. But when they came out onto Broad Quay, there wasn't a quay anymore. There wasn't even a river. Now it was an open plaza with fountains and benches and trees dotted around. Try as he might, Jo couldn't match it to anything he'd seen in Lucy's world. "We'll go across here," Dad said. "We could look into the cathedral, though there's probably a service on since it's Sunday. Or there's the Georgian House Museum I mentioned yesterday, the sugar merchant's house. Shall we have a look?" "Maybe." Jo paused. "I did wonder if we might walk up onto the hill, if you still can." "What do you mean, if you still can? Which hill?" Jo pointed in what felt like the right direction. "There was a road off Park Street that led up onto it, I thought." He tried to keep his voice vague, but his information still sounded oddly precise, considering he wasn't supposed to know Bristol. "I saw something on a map," he added, unconvincingly. "That sounds like Brandon Hill. Fancy you noticing that. It's not all that big. But yes, we could certainly walk up to the Cabot Tower. I can think of worse things to do on a lovely morning." Jo's eyes were out on stalks as they walked on now. He was fairly sure they had joined the route he'd taken yesterday in the carriage with Hannah and Mary. Most of it was completely unrecognisable, and yet there were occasional corners, a pub here, a row of buildings there, that he thought he'd seen in Lucy's world. It was strange to find them in such a different setting. They looked so small and fragile among the newer buildings. And yet they weren't fragile, really. These were the survivors, anchor points against the rising tide of change. "This is College Green," Dad said, as they reached the triangle of grass Joe had passed in the carriage. "I think I pointed it out on Friday night." Joe gazed across the green, just as puzzled as when he'd been with Lucy. In her time there had been a small church at the tip of the triangle, which was now gone. And he'd been right about the cathedral. It was definitely whole now, where in the past at least half of it had been missing. Not yet built, he supposed. "It's such a trip down memory lane for me," Dad said. "That big tower up there at the top of the road is one of the main university buildings, so all this was my stamping ground." "And we're going up Park Street?" Dad nodded. Joe looked at the road ahead. "I thought it was steeper," he said, remembering the dip in the road and the horses and carriages ploughing up the other side. "Believe me," Dad laughed, "when you're late for a lecture, this is steep enough." But Joe wasn't listening. There was a bridge here now, he saw, right where the dip had been. He wouldn't have noticed it at all if he hadn't been looking, but this must explain the change, because the cross street underneath was a long way down, while Park Street had been smoothed out over the top. He started hunting for numbers. All of the buildings on both sides were now cafes or shops. They seemed to have offices and flats above them, some expensive looking, others grimy with torn curtains at their windows. But the first number he could see was 11. Then came a side road, and then a large building with columns and a frieze of Greeks or Romans above the entrance. Joe was positive he hadn't seen it with Lucy, even though it looked as though it could have been there. "What's that?" he asked. "I think it's the Freemasons' Hall," Dad said. "They're a rather secretive organisation, which is why it's not marked." Beyond came number 33. There was no number 5, nor anything close. Joe struggled to hide his disappointment. Lucy's house had gone. He turned on the pavement to look back down the road just to be certain, and without warning, the rushing sound filled his ears. He crouched down quickly as though he was tying his shoelaces. With luck, that would give him a few moments to recover when he got back later. Then all thought of later was gone, swept away with his own world. The cars and buses, the shops and cafes with their music, the hum of the electric city, all replaced by the rumble of cartwheels and men shouting. For the second time in 2 days, Joe felt dazed by the abruptness of the change. He moved to hold on to some railings and waited until he felt steadier. He was standing outside the house next door to Lucy's. This must be the spot he'd disappeared from last time. He looked both ways. It also seemed to be just a few meters up from where he'd crouched down in his own world. So he must have been right outside her house, all dejected at not finding number 5. He grinned. The street had just been renumbered at some point. Why hadn't he thought of that? Horses were heaving carts and carriages up the road, which was indeed steeper than it would be in the future. Joe looked round in the direction he'd been going with Dad. The top half of Park Street wasn't there, nor was the tower that Dad had pointed out. In their place were the trees he'd noticed when he arrived last time, and between them open ground. He glanced down at himself. His shoes and stockings were still spattered with mud from the walk with Lucy on Brandon Hill. But the air was much milder now than it had been that day. It felt like late afternoon, with no sign of it getting dark. The road was running with water, and there was a freshness behind the usual smells of manure and wood smoke. At that moment, the door of Lucy's house opened, and she appeared at the top of the steps with her brother. Peter was looking the other way and didn't see Joe, but Lucy noticed him at once. She said something to Peter, who went back inside the house. "Josiah?" she called, looking intently at Joe. For a split second, Joe was confused. Then the memory of those last bizarre moments came flooding back. Where was the real Josiah now? Not in Lucy's house, presumably, or she wouldn't expect to see him in the street. So did that mean that Joe should pretend to be Josiah again? Could they both be here at the same time? Joe couldn't imagine how. Just seeing Josiah had been enough to eject him from Lucy's world. He stood, rooted to the spot, feeling even more unprepared than usual. Lucy trotted down the steps. "You're not him, are you?" she said softly. "You're the other one." She held out her hand. In her palm was Joe St. Christopher. "I was just wondering about you. I've had this inside my redingote since that day. Every time I've found it, I've thought of you." Joe nodded, but didn't take the pendant from her. "Don't you want it back?" "Not yet," he said. "I can explain." She shook her head. "Later," she said, tucking the St. Christopher away. "We only have a minute before Peter comes back out. You need to do as I say." Joe nodded again, wondering what he was agreeing to. "This time you have to put on a French accent when you speak," she said. "Don't smile, and try to be surly, rude even." "But I'm not normally like that," Joe protested. "Nobody will like me." "Nobody likes Josiah either," Lucy retorted. "If you're going to pass yourself off as him, you have to behave like he does." "What if I don't want to?" "What choice do you have?" she asked sharply. "If you pretend to be him, everything will be much easier. We'll talk about who you actually are later. In the meantime, I'll help you," she added more gently. "You were nice. I'd have much preferred it if you'd stayed instead of him. It was no wonder I thought you'd changed. The real Josiah turned out to be just as nasty as he'd been before." "But he's not here now?" Joe asked. "I thought he was staying for a long time." Lucy snorted. "It feels like he was here years, but it was only 2.5 months. Fortunately, he announced yesterday that he was leaving. We're all delighted to see the back of him. Well, nearly all of us." "So, if I'm supposed to be him, what do we tell them about why I've come back?" "Change of heart," Lucy said quickly. "Here comes Peter. Leave it to me." Joe looked up to see Lucy's brother coming down the steps at the front of the house. "Cousin Josiah!" Peter exclaimed. "Back so soon?" His voice was cold. Joe tried to set his expression to be disagreeable. It felt all wrong. He'd always got on well with Peter before. "The ship ran aground at Shirehampton," Lucy said. "He's walked back." "Why not wait on board for the tide to turn?" Peter asked sourly. "You made it quite plain you didn't want to stay any longer." "I had a change of heart," Joe said, in a horribly bogus French accent. "I thought perhaps it was a sign from God that I was meant to be here." Peter grimaced. Joe wondered whether it was his accent or the prospect of having his cousin back again. "Lucy and I were going for a walk," Peter said, "now that the rain has stopped." He peered at Joe suspiciously. "You look remarkably dry for someone who's walked so far on a day like today." Joe decided it was safest to shrug and say nothing. "I dare say you don't want to join us," Peter prompted him. "You must be tired." Joe thought quickly. He had no desire to go into Lucy's house without her, or have to explain himself without knowing what had happened in his absence. "Actually, now that it's a nice afternoon," he said, "a walk would be pleasant." He realised halfway through speaking that he'd forgotten the accent already, and tried to put it on for the last few words without knowing quite how it should sound. Peter raised an eyebrow. "A reformed character," he said with deep sarcasm. "I'd never have thought that being washed up could improve someone's manners so much." He spun on his heel and set off up the street. Lucy gave Joe a pointed look. What was that supposed to mean? He wondered anxiously. Was he doing such a bad job of impersonating Josiah? Or was she trying to tell him to pick up on Peter's remarks about improved manners and be a little nicer. It was going to be uncomfortable otherwise, having to behave so differently to usual. Already Joe was wishing he hadn't agreed. After all, Lucy seemed to have accepted that he'd appeared out of the blue, so why wouldn't Peter? Except, of course, that Peter hadn't seen him disappear. This time they walked on up Park Street, past the road Joe... I'm not reading very well today, sorry. This time they walked on up Park Street, past the road Joe had taken with Lucy last time. "We thought we'd walk through the park around the Royal Fort," Lucy said, seeing Joe's glance. "We wanted to have a look at the big new building project." Joe nodded, but didn't speak. They continued up the road in silence. Waves of irritation and dislike seemed to be pulsing through the air from Peter. Joe wished he could do something about it. Lucy kept shooting looks his way too, but he guessed she didn't want to ask him anything in front of her brother. The upper part of Park Street was a building site, just as the end of the side road had been before. Joe thought of what Dad had said about the building boom coming from slave money. He pushed the thought to the back of his mind. That would have to wait. Beyond the end of Park Street, they turned off across a common, mostly cleared of trees but still thick with long grass. The path led through a gate and onto parkland, where several groups of men were digging trenches in an expanse of clipped grass. Above, at the top of the rise, a mansion looked down, all over Bristol. "That's Royal Fort House," Lucy said. "Thomas Tyndall has just sold it. They're going to build several crescents of houses on the land." Tyndall, Joe thought grimly. That had been one of the names Dad had mentioned. Thomas Tyndall must have made his money from the slave trade. How quickly the connection had come up, now that he knew about it. Peter huffed. "I don't know why you're telling our cousin all this. If he cared, he'd know already. We must have discussed it half a dozen times in front of him." Lucy looked away. Joe realised she had been explaining for his benefit. "Is your father back yet?" he asked, to change the subject. He was congratulating himself on remembering to use the accent when he saw that the question itself had been a mistake. If Lucy's father had returned from his voyage while Josiah had been staying, he couldn't fail to know. And if not, it was hardly likely to have happened in the few hours that Josiah had been gone. Joe felt colour spread across his cheeks. Peter growled again, but Lucy came to Joe's rescue. "He came home from the sugar house in time for dinner," she said, as though he had been asking something slightly different. "He's working in his study this afternoon. You know how busy it is since he came home 3 weeks ago." Joe knew she'd added the last 3 words to give him the hint he needed. He waited for Peter to object again, but Lucy's brother had brightened. He was waving to someone on the far side of the park. "That's Henry Cunningham and his brother," he said. "I must go and say hello. You'll be all right with Cousin Josiah, won't you, Lucy?" He pulled a face. "Of course," she answered. "Do go. We'll see you back at home." Surprise flashed across Peter's face at his sister's willingness to be left, but he hurried away across the grass without a backwards look. "Phew," Lucy grinned. "That was a stroke of luck. There's so much I want to ask you, but I didn't think I'd get the chance." She watched her brother's retreating figure. I knew he wouldn't be over the moon to see Josiah back again, but he reacted even worse than I expected. "I suppose it comes of knowing he'll have to put up with the 2 of you again." "The 2 of me?" Lucy laughed. "I meant you 2 cousins. My father brought my aunt and her son back from Jamaica with him. I'd never met this other cousin before, but he's turned out to be even more unpleasant than Josiah." "Oh dear, is he supposed to be my cousin too?" "No, he's from the other side of the family. You didn't meet him until we did last month. His name is Tobias. I'll tell you about him in a bit, but first I want to know all about you. Who on earth are you?" But Joe was staring at her, open-mouthed. Tobias! He exclaimed in dismay. Oh no, not Tobias. So this is going to be a challenge, isn't it? Because Joe is now going to have to pass himself off as Josiah. French, haughty, entirely unlike Joe himself. Oh dear. And worse still, Tobias is here, after all. Joe was so jubilant to find him apparently not in Lucy's world last time. But no, he's here. So we'll find out how he gets on Monday, when we're back for chapter 8. I'm sorry, that wasn't a very good reading today. It's no wonder I'm struggling to write, isn't it, if I can't even read what I've written. Oh dear. Some days it's fine, some days the words just trip off the tongue and just appear on the screen while I'm writing. And some days they don't. Never mind. Maybe I should stop early. Trouble is, it doesn't work like that. You just got to keep plugging on until it gets done. Because otherwise it doesn't get done. You know that? If you don't sit down at your desk and write, the writing doesn't happen. It's not magic. Anyway, I wish you a nice weekend. I think I'm going to be painting my sitting room this weekend. So it's all excitement here. And other than that, I'll see you on Monday.